Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. When the history of the early 21st century is written, there's no question that illicit drugs will play a part in it. From the opioid epidemic to the daily reports of fentanyl deaths on America's streets, drugs are a lubricant for a nation perpetually on the brink of a nervous breakdown. And as he did with the opioid epidemic, my guest, Sam Quinones, now turns his attention to fentanyl and what it means to our cities, for public policy, and for the individuals and families impacted by it. Sam is a journalist and author. His two acclaimed books of narrative nonfiction about Mexico and Mexican immigration garnered international attention. His book Dreamland won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award for General Nonfiction, and it is my pleasure to welcome Sam Quinones here to talk about The Least of Us, True Tales of America's Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. Sam, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be talking with you again, Jeff. Thanks so much.
First of all, talk a little bit about the history of fentanyl. This isn't a new drug at all. This is something that's been around for a very, very long time.
Since 1960, essentially. It's a fantastic drug, really, in the medical context, when used appropriately and properly. It revolutionized, it's a new kind of synthetic opioid, meaning it's not made from opium poppies, it's made from other chemicals. It's revolutionized anesthesia, and with its surgery, a variety of things were possible with fentanyl. It takes people into anesthesia and out of it very quickly. It's far less dangerous than the other forms that they were using in the 1950s. And it was invented by Paul Janssen, one of the great scientific minds, I think, of the 20th century, invented numerous drugs, but fentanyl was one of them. And it's been part of surgery since the 1960s. It's really been, many people out there most likely have had it and don't realize that they did or weren't aware of it somehow. I had a heart attack 4 years ago, and they gave me fentanyl. And so in the medical context, it's an enormously beneficial substance.
And when did it start becoming something that people used on the streets, recreationally? Many people may remember that Michael Jackson overdosed on it.
Yeah, I think that fentanyl became very gradually introduced to the drug underworld. There were these rogue chemists in the 80s and 90s. You'd see occasional little outbreaks of it. But they didn't last long. They lasted about as long as it took to arrest the underground chemist who was making it. In 2006 is the first time the Mexican drug world recognized fentanyl, and that was in the city of, a lab started in the city of Toluca, which is outside Mexico City, an industrial town, run by a guy named Ricardo Valdez Torres, who had been living in the United States for many, many years since a kid, was deported after being arrested and then tried and convicted of fentanyl manufacturing in San Diego. He gets out, is deported back to Mexico, and the Sinaloa drug cartel contacts him, offers to fund a lab as he would make. They really wanted him to make ephedrine, which is a precursor in one of the ways you make methamphetamine. Right. He wanted to make fentanyl. He thought he had this great thing, and he was going to make $1 million, and that they didn't quite understand it yet, and he had to educate them. In fact, that's what happened. He began to make this stuff, and what happened was very tragic. He tested his fentanyl on mice and found that it would not kill the mice if it was diluted 50-1. The guys who took the fentanyl from him, who bought it from him and then shipped it north into the United States, first into Chicago, I think would kind of tell people this, but nobody on the street believed it, is the way of the reports I'm getting, that nobody thought you could possibly cut a drug 50. So 1 kilo would make 50 kilos. I mean, the drug was almost useless. It was a non-drug. No one would buy it. And so nobody did that. But what ends up happening is that fentanyl, for the first time, you see mass death because of fentanyl, because of this one lab in Toluca, Mexico, where the guy was producing that. And that lasted about, 8-9 months before they finally busted. But along that time, it kills people in, we're talking thousands of people in Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Cleveland, I believe, Camden. It kind of stretches its way across over those months. And then when the lab is busted in 2006, April 2006, eventually that fentanyl they just sold out, peters out, and those deaths just vanish. It's a perfect example of supply reduction equaling harm reduction. And but that was the first time, it's a historic moment, really. It's the first time the Mexican trafficking world began to realize that there was a kind of a replacement for heroin. This was a heroin replacement thing. You didn't need land, you didn't need farmers, seasons, irrigation, any of that. You just needed a lab, certain chemicals, and a few folks who knew what they were doing. And you could produce it year round if you had the chemicals to do so. And it was their kind of realization that gradually grew into the problem that we're seeing today.
How much of that movement forward and attractiveness of this came about because of what was going on with heroin, the fact that it was getting more scarce, more difficult to produce, etc.?
I think the Mexican trafficking world had already learned that if you can make chemicals in a lab, it is far, far superior from a business standpoint than growing them. And they'd learned that with methamphetamine first. They really had already by then dominated the methamphetamine world, and we can talk about that later if you like. But they'd already knew this idea. The Mexican trafficking world grew up on land. They were rancheros, they were farmers, and the whole idea was you grow marijuana, you grow opium poppies, that kind of thing. Well, as time went on, they began to realize that there were these substitutes, and for heroin, fentanyl was a substitute. It made perfect economic sense that you would not have to have land that you had to protect, that was outside growing under the sun, that helicopters could come over. There was a large supply chain associated with growing drugs. There was packers and harvesters and transporters, and it was bulky and all this stuff. And so with fentanyl, they began to realize, gee, we can reduce that supply chain dramatically. I think what also began to happen was, yes, at a certain point, our heroin demand, all this grows from the opioid epidemic, right? All of this grows from this massive prescribing of opioid painkillers, and a lot of those folks, significant numbers of those folks who use it, starting to get addicted. They then, many of them, switch to heroin. At a certain point, they're really using a lot of the heroin that Mexico can produce, and so there's this natural idea to say, what else can we do? And that's when this whole case of, out of Toluca, Mexico becomes very relevant. Everyone goes, well, there is this other stuff, maybe I think we should just switch to that. And what's happened is fentanyl has the economic sense behind fentanyl is perfect. It's so much better from a business standpoint as a drug trafficker to make your own dope. It costs less. The profit is geometrically higher. And so that's what you see. And now you don't see much demand for opium poppies. And the opium poppy farmers in Mexico are really in what you might call depression. The prices drop, nobody's buying it. That's because in the United States, most people now, if they're using an opioid, it's going to be fentanyl. And a lot of folks now are just simply addicted to fentanyl.
And of course, one of the things you've alluded to this, one of the things about it is that it was so incredibly cheap, even in terms of its street price.
Right. Yes. I interviewed a kid who was making counterfeit pills, and he did the math for me, his own math, and he bought a quarter kilo of fentanyl from China, and he would turn that with a pill press and some other binder chemicals. He would turn that fentanyl into counterfeit pills that look like oxycodone, generic oxycodone, 30 milligram pills. And he would buy that fentanyl for $5,000. He could turn that into $2 million because it's so potent. Very, very little of this drug is needed to get people high. In fact, a little bit more than what's needed will kill them. That's the other that's the main problem with illicit use of fentanyl. It's very, very difficult to mix it properly, And so therefore that's why we are seeing this these record deaths over the last several years. Really, it's connected to the substitution of fentanyl for heroin.
Because it can be made in these labs and done so secretly, it has been very, very difficult for the DEA or any law enforcement, either here, Mexico, or anywhere else, to really find out where it's coming from.
Well, I think now what's happened is it's mostly coming from Mexico. Now, specifically where, I think that's the problem. There's lots and lots of producers of this stuff because the knowledge has spread that if you know, how to make it is the knowledge of that has spread. Plus, in Mexico, there are two very prominent shipping ports on the Pacific coast, straight down from Arizona, a couple of days drive, you'll get to them. And the traffickers control or have enough control to be able to get access to enormous quantities of the chemicals now that they require to make fentanyl. And so they can make it. The thing about synthetic drugs too is if you have those chemicals, you can make it year round. It's not like marijuana. You got to grow it every 4 months. You need the sun, et cetera, et cetera. No, you can make this in a lab all year round if, crucially, you have access to shipping ports, and that's what they now have, right? In the era of synthetic drugs, which is what I say in the book we are now firmly in, land doesn't matter as much, certainly as much as it used to. What matters is access to shipping ports, because from shipping ports, you get access to the entire world chemical market. That means chemicals made in Chile, in China, India, Czech Republic, you name it. You can get them all. And that is the crucial thing. And they have control of law enforcement enough so that they can do this. They have control of those ports, and hence you're seeing the production out of Mexico just of synthetic drugs, primarily fentanyl and methamphetamine, is just astounding, staggering, the quantities of drug coming out of there now.
To what extent are we seeing this epidemic of use in other parts of the world, or is this a particularly American problem?
I would say, fentanyl makes sense for traffickers the world over. And so you have seen outbreaks of fentanyl or fentanyl analogs. There's kind of fentanyl cousins that are similar to fentanyl, sometimes far more potent even, believe it or not, than fentanyl. You see this in other parts of the world, and it's entirely possible that as time goes on, really there won't be much production of heroin, strict heroin, because it's just going to crowd it out. It's going to outcompete it. Fentanyl will. I don't think, though, that any country, and you've seen these things in Sweden, reports in Estonia, different places, Russia, I believe, but I don't think any country has quite the problem that we have in this country for two reasons. One is we, through our opioid epidemic of painkillers, we created a brand new market of opioid addicted customers that did not exist in 1995. By 2005 and 2015, that population is enormous, and so clearly there's a market. Plus, we happen to reside right next to the country that has one of the most sophisticated drug underworlds on the planet, and that's Mexico. And those guys are constantly innovating. It's a highly innovative industry, it seems to me at times. And so you have those two combinations, our own creation of opioid addicted consumer base, and connected to the problem of what's going on down in Mexico. A lot of which, by the way, it's important to really note this, that the impunity with which the traffickers down there produce these drugs is really dependent on deep corruption within Mexico, an unprepared police force, unfunded, et cetera, and withered morale as well, but also because traffickers in Mexico can get all the guns that they need to enforce their will from the United States. There's been long history of drug trafficking south into Mexico with which they can enforce that impunity. So all of that is why we have this issue perhaps far more acutely than any other country on the planet.
How is this related to or an evolution of the meth crisis that we saw in this country in the 80s?
Well, in the 1980s and 90s is when the Mexican trafficking world discovered methamphetamine, and with that, the idea that you could manufacture drugs instead of growing them. That was the first time they did. Now what's happened, though, is that this is morphed. It's connected to this whole problem we've just been talking about, because they took that industry they made industrialized meth, in fact, and they made it with one chemical known as ephedrine, which you find in antihistamine, Sudafed pills, et cetera, that kind of stuff. Well, this process, very easy to make, very clean, really, it's not too difficult to do. Turn them, and they realized, geez, why grow a plant, you know? And that's when the idea first took hold. We're in the wrong business. We need to be making drugs, not growing them or buying them from the Colombians whom we hate. So they began to do that, but then everything changed. So the ephedrine meth was a kind of a party meth, and you began to see people using it, and it was kind of like everyone wanted to party, stay up all night, be up for 2-3 days. You began to see after a while, you began to see those famous mugshot posters where you see people over 6 or 8 years gradually decline, pocked, all that, very famous. All of that in 2008 changed, though. Mexico made ephedrine illegal, except for a few pharmaceutical companies to possess. And the Mexican trafficking world switched to another form of making meth that is far more messy, stinky, requires more chemicals, but it has one benefit to them that the ephedrine method doesn't, and that is you can make the precursors to this form of meth with a variety of toxic, industrial, legal, very common chemicals. And that means that you can get supplies, if you control world chemical markets and the ports, you can get supplies of this stuff to be making it in by the ton all year round. And that is really what's happened. So the meth business that they were in changed in 2008. By the time 2010, 11, 12 rolled around, it was pretty much this entire new method of making meth. The problem is, and so what you found is, you began to see methamphetamine marching across the country, destroying local manufacturers, these small-time guys who would make an ounce or two here and there. Now none of that happens. It's all Mexican meth, and it's all coast to coast. The problem with this meth, though, fentanyl will kill you, but this meth, perhaps because it's made with such toxic chemicals, it's not clear why, but what is definitely clear is that this meth is creating vast, very quick, rapid onset of symptoms of mental illness, schizophrenia, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, a lot of things like that. So you're seeing, and with that, of course, comes homelessness. So we're seeing, as they have switched to meth, as they have switched to making meth this new way, and as that method has really been learned and caught on, and now everybody kind of knows how to do it down there, you're seeing widespread psychiatric problems on people on the street, even more than before, and all connected to meth. And then connected to that as well is our expansion of our homeless problem, particularly, well, all over the country, but especially notable at times in areas that never really had any homeless problem to speak of before that. And so that is the other kind of side of this synthetic drug era that we're now in. Fentanyl will kill you. The meth will drive you to mental illness and homelessness.
How has the crackdown or the attempted crackdown on opioid use, which you've written extensively about in Dreamland, how has that impacted the increased use of these other synthetic drugs?
Yes, at times what has happened is people who have been using the painkillers, the opioid painkillers, some of them prescribed by doctors, others simply bought on the black market, some people never needing them in the first place, but just because the supply was so vast, they ended up using them at a party, say, and they started to develop a habit after that. what begins to happen is that those pills, doctors get very worried. The CDC and various authorities start saying, "Wait, we gotta be careful about this." And in fact, they needed to be careful. The problem is, of course, you've got people out there who are dependent on these pills in one form or another, and they don't have many other options. Now, some people don't have access to treatment. Other folks are legitimate pain patients who are then like scurrying around to find something to deal with the very real and terrifying pain that they feel, life-mangling pain that they feel. A lot of these folks then begin to look on the street for whatever they can find, for whatever painkiller they can find. What then begins to happen, I would say as well, is that the Mexican drug world changes again or morphs again. And what you've seen now in the last few years, since roughly about 2017, is an expansion of the counterfeit pill that looks like an oxycodone generic 30 milligram pill or a Xanax or a Percocet branded opioid. It now contains nothing really but fentanyl. Fentanyl has allowed the trafficking world to do a couple of things. One is provide to all those people who are really using pills and now don't have maybe the access that they once had to those pills, and provide them with pills that really are fentanyl, very dangerous pills, very deadly, can be very, very often. But also fentanyl has allowed the trafficking world for the first time access to our American culture. Americans' love affair with pills goes back to at least, Valium in the 1960s. And the trafficking world has never been able to take advantage of that until fentanyl came along. And fentanyl comes along, and all of a sudden you can put a few grains of the stuff in every pill, and you could sell it as if it were an opioid, as if it were a hydrocodone, or an oxycodone pill. The problem is, of course, you have to make sure it's well mixed and frequent, and very, very often that's not the case. A lot of those are mixed, I guess, properly in quotes, but there's frequently cases where they're not. And so it is, once again, you see these kind of transformations that happen every few years, very quickly responding to market conditions, and the counterfeit pills are kind of one of those responses to that issue you just mentioned.
Given all of this, is there any reason to think that there's anything that policy or law enforcement can do to get any kind of a rein in on this?
Well, I do believe what this is calling on us to do a few things. One is to develop a far deeper connection with Mexico. I have to say, I lived in Mexico for 10 years as a journalist, and we have never developed the kind of relationship with Mexico that really it requires, given the nature of the problems that exist between the two countries. It's such an important country for us, and we still don't know a thing about it, really. Ask yourself how many congressmen can name the 6 Mexican border states with the United States. I mean, very few probably. It's like we need to develop so that with that relationship, we can then move towards actual collaboration, us doing something about our guns, them doing something about the brazen, way in which this stuff is promoted. I often ask people, what do you think the price of an AK-47 that's smuggled south from the United States into Mexico is? In my opinion, the price is meth made with impunity and now at the lowest price it's ever been and turning people crazy. To me, that's the price we're paying for that. And I would say Mexico too is I would say fairly blithely not worried about its corruption. I think a lot of Mexicans are, but I think there's just this attitude in the government that it doesn't really matter or something. It's not been addressed forthrightly, and I believe that needs to happen. I also think that we need to start expanding a variety of ways of dealing with this that are not that we haven't done so far. Expanding treatment options, absolutely developing more prevention efforts at the local level. I think we need to rethink how jail is done. Jail has never been a solution. It's always been part of the problem. You're always going to have jail when you have drugs involved. The biggest, even if all were legal, even the biggest drug to send people to jail is alcohol because it's cheap and available everywhere. We need to rethink how jail is done, how jail can be a place for recovery to begin instead of a place where just people veg out, watch Judge Judy all day long, sleep all day long, do nothing productive. Now you're seeing that happen in a lot of counties. They're experimenting with new ways of dealing with jail. To me, that's a huge step forward. It's a necessary step forward. It's not the solution. There is no one solution. But I think also it just gets back, frankly, to an idea that we have done so much to shred and destroy community in this country in a million different ways. We could go on for quite a long time about that topic. And I think part of the reason I called the book The Least of Us is because this is calling on us as Americans to return to the small local initiatives, the small stuff in neighborhood unification, strengthening, having a barbecue, being outside, getting to know your neighbors, being around each other, coming out of the house. So often I think that if we just do that, it will break down a lot of the awkwardness and a lot of the suspicion and a lot of the fear and, I don't think like him politically, so what am I going to talk to him about, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. To me, I believe that's why I called the book The Least of Us. We have to get back to concern about the folks who are most vulnerable, that grocery store clerk who may or may not have health insurance but still have to show up in the middle of COVID, for example, that addict eating from the trash, but also get back to these small things. And so that's why half of my book, The Least of Us, is really about finding the least noticed, non-sexy, publicized stories of Americans involved in community repair that I could find. I wanted to make it small because for too often we've been looking for the big splashy answer that's going to solve all. And that's how we got into this. We wanted for the mystery of human pain, we wanted one magical answer, and that turned out to be opioid painkillers, which do a wonderful job in some cases, but frequently lead to unintended consequences, of which we are now in the middle of living with.
Sam Quinones, his book is The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. Sam, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure, Jeff. Anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.